Hi, welcome back. Ross Ford here to just a little bit more legislative update. We are going to jump right in where we left off and kind of look what has happened over the last week. And we will start with HB 58, which was the bill dealing with building inspector or actually building official amendments. It's gone through committee. It's sparked an awful lot of discussion. Obviously, the building inspectors, building officials, cities, builders, everybody has a fair amount of passion over this bill. I think we've got most of the details worked out on it, and we've talked about them previously. The big holdup, I'd say, is the cities are concerned they're not going to be able to get the building officials to what we classify as qualified fast enough. So they're asking for a delay of like a year and a half. Obviously, we struggle with that because, to start with, it raises the question, why do we have a bunch of building officials that aren't qualified that obviously now for years have been making that final decision on what you do on a building? If there's ever a question of how does the code apply or what do, we go to the building official for that clarification, and we find out there's a bunch that haven't been qualified, and that should cause us all a little bit of concern that maybe cities have not been doing their due diligence to have the right people where they should to do what they should to protect the public. That being said, I believe there's a compromise on the table that will say, okay, in January is when this will roll out. Everybody will have to be qualified and we'll have to do it. Now, there's a hope that we can get DOPL to start collecting the data so that we have more of the report card on what the building officials are doing prior to that, but we'll see. Right now, it's just moving along, and we'll see where we go. Next bill, and I'm going to talk about these two together. It's House Bill 88 and House Bill 90. And the reason I want to talk about them together is because they're both by the same representative. It's Representative Ray Ward. And they're two different things, but they're him trying to find a way to reduce the cost of housing. He presented them together. They both failed in committee, so we'll start with that. The reason I want to talk about them isn't that because they failed, it's why they failed. And I think that's a big concern. First of all, during the legislative process, just because you have the different branches of government, as a general rule, the governor, who is the executive branch for Utah, does not come weigh in the legislative branch, our legislators, into their process. He has the final say on their process in that he can approve or veto their bills, but doesn't necessarily get involved with the process and lets it run. This one's a big enough issue that he actually sent his senior housing policy advisor to testify in favor of these bills and this concept and say, okay, here, let's move it, which is just pretty rare. And I think it's impressive that the governor's willing to put political capital out there like that. Nonetheless, it didn't get the win. But some of the things that were a concern are just interesting, maybe not a concern, but interesting, that the League of Cities and Towns used to defeat this bill. So one of the points they said, and I probably have the number wrong, but I believe they said there were 19,000 entitled lots already available in Utah. To start with, let me remind all of you what this is. The first bill we're talking about, and again, these arguments apply to both. The first one we're talking about was the ability to put an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, a small apartment, on your property. We currently have the ability to put them within your house, but it's an internal ADU. This would be external, so it could just go out on your lot somewhere. You'd have to have parking, you'd have to have all the fire safety, you'd have to have everything to make it safe. But by right, if you had a residential house and you could fit it on there with the parking, you could do it. So the city says that because we have so many entitled lots, there's no reason to do this. And they talked about the 19, and again, I'm probably wrong on the 19,000, but it's some really big number like that. The problem is, and this didn't come up in committee, it came up in a discussion afterwards. And just two quick examples about their, quote, 19,000 entitled lots. There was one builder that he has probably half a dozen lots out in West Valley City. And because of the restrictions the city puts on the lots, it has to be a house of a certain size. They go as far as making them sign a development agreement that talks about what they will put inside the house, that you have to go in the house and have, high toilets with soft close lids. You have to have granite countertops. But it's a ton of things, all expensive things that add costs to it. Well, he ends up with homes that he has to sell for $1 million. We don't get $1 million home buyers out in West Valley City. So although the lots are there, they're not really buildable under the circumstances they are. There's another builder, and he has a few dozen lots, and I don't remember where he said they were, but there were certain infrastructure items that were required to put in to get the lots so that they were buildable, different water, sewer, things like that. And in order to do it, he was literally tens of millions of dollars to get these couple of dozen lots so they could build. Again, not possible. So they're the city's, quote, entitled lots, but they can't be built on. We have lots of lots we see around that they say, no, this is an entitled lot. And it's not even necessarily a papered lot. It's just a piece of ground that the city has says, no, we have zoned this and it's in our master plan that we will let houses go here. But it's 3 miles from any of the utilities. It will be years before it gets out there, or somebody with extreme amounts of money to get it there. And then the lots will be so expensive, they won't be usable. So it's not really a fair nor accurate statement to say there are that many lots there. Nonetheless, they use it, and it seems to win. One of their other ones, and this one came from Mayor Walker. He's the mayor of Draper. He's also the president of the League of Cities and Towns this year. And he used his city, Draper, as an example and said, look, we've had ADUs allowed in our city forever, for long as he knows. And it doesn't really drive a lot. We don't get a lot of permits. It just doesn't happen. But we don't need the law to tell us we do that, that we need to do that, because we're already doing it. The problem is that he basically is saying, well, if we have one single city anywhere in the state that does something right, then we get to transpose that on the whole state and say, well, all cities are doing it right. Maybe Draper's doing something that's good, and maybe Draper's got something in place that helps affordable housing and gives opportunity. But it doesn't mean all of the other cities do. And if this law were to go into effect, it obviously wouldn't make one bit of difference to Draper because they're already doing it. He shouldn't have any reason to oppose it. The problem is they align themselves, or they gather themselves together and take a position to protect those cities that aren't doing what needs to be. And he also, obviously this wasn't his point, but he kind of accidentally made the point in our favor that by having those ADUs allowed within the city, it doesn't impact any of the infrastructure or anything because not that many people do it. It's kind of a limited thing. So one of the other things the league claimed is it would strip this city's ability to properly plan out their city, that they need to have the ability to say, here's where we're going to put what type of housing, and they need to do that because of infrastructure. As we just pointed out, it's not that big of an impact on the infrastructure. If we already have houses sitting there, to add an ADU is not going to overwhelm the sewer system or the water system, and it happens so rarely that it's not going to be an issue. But when it happens, if you happen to be the homeowner that says, no, I need an ADU to help make my payment, and I happen to be somebody that says, wow, I need somewhere to live that's reasonable, then this is a good partnership, and we should allow it to happen. The other thing is the cities just refuse to accept just the hard, cold data that our population has changed. We can look at the census data. It's absolutely crystal clear that the size of families we have now are not the size of families we had 30 years ago. So we go into some of these old neighborhoods and say, okay, we want to add an ADU. And the argument is, well, that ADU will overwhelm the system. But that's not true, because the family that lived in the home 30 years ago is a fraction of the size as it is now. And it's fairly easy to argue that the family that's there now plus the ADU is still less than the family that used to be there when they designed the system. So at some point, we have to throw those little facts in there and keep them straight. And we kind of have touched on it. There's just very few people that have a yard that will work for an ADU. There's very few people that have the means to say, I'm going to build an ADU. And there's very few people that have the yard, the means, and say, yeah, I want to put a neighbor in my backyard. They want to keep their backyard. So it's a very limited kind of use. So it's a pretty small impact, but it's one of the million little impacts we need to solve this housing problem. So the other one on 90, I guess and this one, to touch on it again, they were presented together, kind of both went down together. This one would allow for anywhere there's a residential unit, you'd have 4,000 square foot lots. So you could do smaller lots. It also allowed for wherever we have commercial zoning, you could put housing. So you could put an apartment building on like an old Kmart site or an old Walmart site that right now is just sitting as a big empty building. So the kind of the key argument on this one, and again, is it was lightly argued. The first bill was presented, and then this one kind of went with it. But if I was to summarize their argument, and it's probably not fair for me to put words in their mouth, but I'm going to anyway, is Basically, they said the cities need to do the planning and they know what's best. They know what's best for their city, and the state government really shouldn't be meddling in the city's business. They should stay out of it. The problem is the cities have had this authority, this land use authority, and here's what we're going to do, and they've had it forever. And we're faced with this crisis, and this crisis has got worse year after year after year, and the cities have done nothing to fix it. So they have it, they say, we're the best to solve the problem, trust us, we're the one that knows what our people need, we'll do it, but they haven't. And it seems to be a decent argument that they won't. So the only thing that we really see that is consistent in housing and their management of it is that the housing stock has gone down relative to the need, and costs, the regulatory fees and costs continue to go up. So it doesn't work. So let me touch on just a couple of things to make that point. That, I don't know, 30 years ago or so, when I first started building, the code book was just a little book. You could almost put it in your back pocket. Everybody had one. It wasn't a big deal. Now we have a stack of code books. The code continues to grow. And the only ones who can vote to add more code to the code are code officials. It's not the industry. It's lots of manufacturers bring ideas and say, hey, here's a new product, we should put it in the code book. And then the code officials vote to do that. And that book has just gotten insane and really expensive. Back in the day, people would build what they could afford. And that could be they would build a really small home. It wouldn't have a garage. They would have unfinished spaces, almost always unfinished basements, which we still do, but they'd also have other unfinished rooms. Rarely did they do landscaping. That was something done, and often done a year later. There were people who would build a basement home. Say, I put the foundation in, I'm going to put a roof on it, I'll build up from that when I have the money. Now, any of those things absolutely wouldn't be heard of. You can't do it. It is an enormous fight to think that we would even suggest we're going to build a smaller home on a smaller lot and have it set up to build the garage at some later date is just completely unacceptable. Not that many years ago, that was how we all got into a house. So now what we see from the cities is the requirement to build bigger homes. We're forced to put them in HOAs, so there's an additional fee so that the city isn't liable for all the expenses of the infrastructure that the residents hey, there's property taxes, and then they also have to cover all these HOA fees for the things the city says we're not going to cover. Plan checks. Don't even need to get into plan checks, other than that's just become an industry all in of itself. It's become a whole business. Again, going back that 30 years when I first started it, a plan check was standing at the counter with the building official and him thumbing through your set of plans that are 4 or 5 pages long and saying, look, here's a couple of things I think you missed. It'll save you money. Let's catch them right now. Super helpful. Made a note on the plan, stamped them. He got a stamp set, and we were off building. Now our plans are dozens of pages long, and plan checks take months to get done and cost thousands and thousands of dollars to do it. According to NHB's statistics, it's on just a standard size home now, our regulatory fees are well over $100,000 of the selling price of a new home. Some of that regulation is necessary. We're not suggesting that you eliminate it all, but some of it is just wasted money. It does not change the performance of the home, doesn't help the homeowner, doesn't help the community, it doesn't help anybody. It's just money. A lot of it is delays, that bills are racked up tens of thousands of dollars at a time while we delay a project just because we're not moving it through the process fast enough. So I'm kind of thinking it would be really cool if we got a little bit of the Doge going in Utah, and let's look at some of this stuff that's pointless waste and deal with it. Enough of my soapbox on that one. Let's go on. Representative White, and we have not talked about this bill. This is HB 368. This is a bill that's been being worked on all year by pretty much all of the stakeholders. The League of Cities and Towns, there's the Commission on Housing Affordability that has weighed in on this. Obviously, us as the home builders, the Property Rights Coalition, and a lot of other entities have come in and weighed in on it. And it's an enormous bill. I'm thinking it's like 220 pages, lots and lots of stuff in it. Overall, it's a good bill. Everybody's happy with parts and unhappy with parts, but we're not going to hit it in detail, but let me just give you a couple of really quick bullet points of what's in it. First of all, a big section in the front of the bill is just a redraft of the annexation. Annexation and how you annex property into a city was put together years and years and years ago. And over the years, it's been tweaked. It's a little change here, and it's just a mess. It was hard to read. It was hard to enforce. It was hard for everybody to understand. So a group of guys have taken it and spent 2 years now just redrafting it. No policy changes, just a redraft. So that what it says it clearly now and everybody can understand it. Now, there are some policy changes that need to happen, and maybe next year we will look at doing those. But for the most part, this was just to clear it up. The other thing is it fixed some problems with plan checks, and it created a new problem for us. So some of the problems it fixed is it clarified what a workday was. We have a lot of cities that say, well, we work 4/10, so they're given 14 work days to complete a plan check, and they say, well, we work 4/10s, so our week is only 4 days long, and that stretches it out a whole additional week. It made it crystal clear that a workday is every weekday with the exception of holidays. So your 4-day work week, then because you're working longer hours, that's fine, but you still need to take up that Friday you took off. The theory is you get it done quicker on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And if you can't, then it still doesn't count against the time frame. The big problem it created is it gave the cities an additional 3 days on the review process. Now, they're calling it a review to review the application. So we submit the application. There's a fair amount of stuff in the application. This gives them time to review the application to make sure it's correct, because once it's correct, that starts ticking off the 14 days for the plan check. The problem is it left them places to stop that plan check throughout the time. It's not that at the end of the 3 days, they say, okay, we're done, and it's either good or it's not, and you can accept it and count on it. It's, okay, well, if we miss something, we still have an opportunity to come back on you in the 14 days. So I don't particularly love that, but it does clarify other things. So it's one of the things we ended up accepting. The really good thing for us is it is always said in the law that if they miss their 14 days, they lose the right to require a plan check. Now, most of the cities don't do that, and there's no teeth, there's no way to enforce it. Well, this gives us a little bit of teeth in it, that it says if you miss your timeline, that at the end of that timeline, the city loses the right to require the plan check and has to repay the plan check fee. So now if they don't get it done on time, they could actually lose some money on it. So hopefully that has them working. So some of the other things that it does, it removes the city's ability to require a landscaping plan for a certificate of occupancy for the private, so somebody's front yard. That cities continue to want to regulate your landscaping, and that's gone through a variety of iterations over the years, and kind of got to where it specifically said, no, you can't do that. You can't require the landscaping in certain parts of it. So some cities said, well, what we're going to require is plans. You'll have to have a landscaping plan in order to get a certificate of occupancy, and this takes that out. It says that if the city's going to require a landscaping bond for public areas, for the common area, that they can still do that, but the bond amount will have to go in an interest-bearing account with the interest going back to the builder. It also says that in that area, and mostly just dealing with the landscaping, not everything. I wish this said it for everything, but it says that the city cannot require the builder to sign a document that is inconsistent with what is in this chapter. Now, we have to be careful with that because sometimes development agreements are very beneficial for all. Problem is we have a lot of cities that have said, look, here's what we want. And if you want to build in our city, here's the development agreement you will sign. And it basically just undoes everything that's been put in the state law for the last 10 years. So this says, at least on this area, that you can't do that. It's just, this is the law and you're going to have to follow it. And then the one other thing to touch on is it says that it kind of underscores what's already in the law, but apparently there were enough loopholes in it, some cities were getting around it, that if you are building a subdivision, you can start building the buildings prior to having asphalt in. So you have to have a drivable surface, it has to be compact, you have to have all your safety things in. You do not have to have asphalt down to start building. You will have to have asphalt into the home in order to get a certificate of occupancy. The other one, and again, this one's a new one and it's moving really, really fast, should be a fun one to watch. It's HB 422. Okay, so this bill is the Rockville bill, and it's just come up in the last, I think, week. It first came up. The reason it came about is because there is a homeowner that has built a house in the town of Rockville. For those of you who don't know where Rockville is, it's a cute little town on the way to Zion. It's not Springdale, which sits right at the mouth of Zion. It's the little town right before it. I'm sure all of you that have gone to Zion have seen it. It's the one with the street lights. There's just a wire strung across the road with a light bulb on it. I love the town. It's the neatest town ever. I think they're trying to hide it and not let a bunch of people move there, keep it a secret. I guess nobody has told them that, I don't know, 60 million people a year drive through that town to go to Zion. So I do think it's been discovered. Nonetheless, this owner is building a house in Rockville, and they wanted to put it in the Parade of Homes with St. George. The Rockville city came and told them that they were not allowed to do it. And if they did, it would be a criminal offense. They would fine them a significant fine, $1,000 a day for every day that they move forward with it, and put them in jail because they didn't want to have that kind of an event in their city. So that's a really dangerous precedent, because sometimes people have an open house or any kind of different event to sell real estate and to show real estate. And if a city's able to say, no, we're not going to do that, then that handicaps anybody ever selling a house anywhere in any city. It's important that the city can't get in the way of free enterprise and people's private property rights to sell their land. This legislation simply says that a city can't control an open house. If you want to have an open house and you want to show your property, you're allowed to do that. And you can't put the person that wants to show their house in jail. This bill has, at this point, passed out of committee. It passed through the House floor and is on its way to the Senate. It's moving along very, very quickly. The idea is to get it all done and complete in time that the homeowner that wants to have it in the Parade of Homes will be able to still show it in that Parade of Homes without the fear of going to jail. And we're not hitting all the bills, by the way. There's still a list. You have to keep looking at the old ones, but these are the ones that kind of had significance this week. SB 86, we talked a little bit about last week. This is the one that will change the requirement for discrimination type rules for businesses that are 15 or more. It would move it down to 5 or more. This bill was heard in committee. The argument really around the bill to support the bill was from a woman who worked at a design center up in, and I believe it was Park City, and she was convinced she was terminated because of her age. She was in her mid-60s, and she said the owner had made comments they wanted a younger person in there, and because of that, she was terminated. And because they were such a small business, she had no recourse. And so a number of people spoke in favor of the bill. Each had a fairly compelling story to say, look, I've been discriminated against, and how that discrimination harms people. And they're all important stories, and we certainly don't advocate for anybody to discriminate against others ever. The problem is those that oppose the bill is that the business have to have rights too. The minute you start saying, okay, well, you're open up to discrimination, if there's an employee that just doesn't fit in my company, they don't want to work the same hours, they want to come a little late, whatever, and in that company I was to let them go, it's easy to make the accusation that, oh, that was discrimination. And then the person who makes the accusation goes on their merry way and nothing happens. But the company who had the accusation made about them could spend the next 90 days to a year disputing that and having to prove that they did not discriminate against somebody. And it's really, really hard to prove something you didn't do. And so it places a really unfair burden on businesses. Most small businesses are more of a family type business. They are fairly intimately connected with all of their employees. And so discrimination is probably less likely to happen because they're friends with everybody. It's not the same as if you're in a company of 200 and HR handles the hiring and firing. These small businesses, everybody knows everybody. It was obvious that the committee didn't like the bill. So there was some debate going back and forth in that. There was additional language added to the bill that is based on a bill that passed last year dealing with discrimination. And there was a mistake made in the bill last year. And so there was language added to this bill that would correct that mistake from last year. And again, it was to protect people. It was to make discrimination less likely to happen. So everybody said, we really like that language and it needs to move forward, but we're not comfortable with moving it down to 5 employees. So an amendment was made to keep the bill, but the original bill amended it from 15 to 5. The new amendment took the proposed bill and amended it from 5 back to 15, and it passed. So it's on its way to the floor, and we will see where it goes. Okay, the next one, and again, new bill for this week, is construction modifications. It's Senator Musselman's. It deals with stormwater. And it's a follow-up on a bill that was passed last year dealing with the stormwater. Last year, the idea was to try and streamline the whole stormwater inspection process. There's a lot of time and money that goes into watching over properties to make sure stormwater doesn't harm the waters of Utah. And this was an attempt to streamline that and make it better. Last year's bill, there were a lot of things that went in last minute. The bill didn't get passed till the very last day, last few hours of the session. And there are a lot of things that went in it that were not good. So this was to fix them. So to just run through those real quick, the main push for last year's was that a city can't go beyond the federal EPA requirements. That there's a belief that the EPA is fairly stringent at what they do, and they're fairly thorough in their research, and that's adequate. So a city, and it was supposed to be a city and the state, cannot go beyond those requirements. The state Division of Environmental Quality managed to have themselves amended out of that. This year's bill puts them back into it and just saying, no, we're going to go with EPA's standard. And it requires the state, cities, everybody to list what they're going to be the best management practices that will be used. What are the ones that they will accept so the builders know and can put that in their plan? A lot of times a builder will put together a plan, say, here's how I'm going to manage my stormwater. They turn it into the city, and the city says, we won't accept that particular technology because we just don't like it. This says, no, you have to give us a list of what you accept so we know we build that plan out and we're good to go. It sets an escalating enforcement policy. The one that went in at last year said, well, after 2 warnings, they red tag the job. This one says after 2 warnings, and you get a couple of days to fix the problem. If the problem persists, then you can be given a fine, and it gives it a fine schedule so that it can't get crazy. It makes it clear that you can use electronic inspections to do this. However, if the builders choose not to, it's a choice. It's up to the builder, not to the city. If as a builder, I say, hey, I don't mind having the city come in and look at it, that's the easiest way for me to do it, the builder can choose that. If the builder says, no, I really don't want the city inspector here while they're in tenant, I just want to send a series of pictures, they can do that too, but it's up to the builder. One of the other things it defines is a definition for immediate and imminent threat. Because there's all kinds of things that are triggered if there's an imminent or an immediate threat to the water. And there were some of the water inspectors that, or the stormwater inspectors that were saying, oh no, anything that violates any of these rules, we believe at a minimum is an imminent threat because something will happen and that's going to get into the water and that will be bad. This bill goes through and says, no, for an immediate threat, you actually have to have a discharge going into the water right now. For an imminent threat, we have to see it happening within a certain number of hours. It has to be a storm is on its way and there is a problem here and nobody's fixing it, and it is more than likely within the day that it will go in there so that we can do that. It also gives the city a timeline to review the SWIPs. Some of them, you have to get that SWIP reviewed by the city, and that sometimes becomes the pinch point on whether or not you can build. With that, I would say that's kind of covered what we have done during this past week. Next week should be busy. They're moving more bills to floor time and moving them along. We're getting to that time of the session where things go quick, so stay tuned.